Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, City Partnerships for Centering Equity in Clean Energy Policy and Implementation. On this webinar, we will discuss local efforts that prioritize social equity in clean energy policymaking, with a focus on efforts to advance social equity in two leading cities, Providence, Rhode Island, and Portland, Oregon. My name is Arielle Drehobel, and I'm the Local Policy Manager for Energy Equity at ACEEE, and I'll be your moderator for our discussion today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. Your screen is customizable. Feel free to move the various windows make them as large or as small as you would like. You can even minimize them to drop down the menu at the bottom of your screen. Click through the widgets at the bottom of the screen to be sure you aren't missing any options available. Presentations can be downloaded as PDFs from the presentation list in the menu. And as a reminder, attendees are in listen-only mode, but can submit questions through the Q&A box at any time during the webcast. The presenters can respond to questions throughout, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A for all the participants. The Q&A can be accessed in the menu at the bottom of your screen if it's not already visible. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be shared with all registrants. And now I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Stefan Samaripas, Local Policy Manager at ACEEE, Monica Huertas, Green Justice Zone Coordinator on Racial and Environmental Justice Committee of Providence, Leah Bamberger, the Director of Sustainability at the City of Providence, and Oriana Magnera, Climate and Energy Policy Coordinator at Verde in Portland, Oregon. So we will start with our first speaker, who is Stefan Samaripas. He is the co-author of ACEEE's 2020 City Clean Energy Scorecard. Stefan's presentation will provide a quick overview of how cities in ACEEE's Clean Energy Scorecard are approaching their clean energy work with a focus on social equity. And now I'll turn it over to Stefan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Arielle. And as Arielle mentioned, I'm just going to give a real quick introduction today, speaking briefly about some of the work that comes out of our city's Clean Energy Scorecard that was released just, I guess, about 2 months ago. I'm going to focus particularly on the research that really comes out of us looking at several equity metrics in the scorecard. So equity-focused actions, strategies, policies, programs that cities are pursuing at the local level. But I will just quickly mention here, for those that are unfamiliar with the City Clean Energy Scorecard, this edition, we looked at 100 cities in the largest metropolitan areas in the U.S., and you'll see that shown up here on the map on the screen. We look at clean energy, and by clean energy, particularly focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy strategies. We look at those strategies through 5 different lenses. We look at local government operations, what's going on, at the municipal level, municipal operations. We look at community-wide initiatives, those that are affecting multiple different areas of a community, buildings policies, what's going on with energy and water utilities at the local level, and finally, transportation policies. And so, as I mentioned, we're going to focus specifically today on the equity-driven actions that cities are pursuing. And when it comes to the Clean Energy Scorecard, we look at these in several different dimensions. We have a wide variety of different metrics that take a look at these actions and track them. And you can see some examples on the screen here. I won't go through all of these, but I will mention for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the approaches that cities are taking in terms of climate and clean energy planning and implementation. But throughout the scorecard, and there are several resources I'll point you to before I sign off here that will tell you a little bit more about what's going on with utility programs, transit, workforce development, incentives and financing for low-income communities. There's a lot that we track in the scorecard. Well, like I said, I'm going to focus for just a couple of minutes here on sort of the approaches that people are taking in sort of planning and implementing policies at the local level, and with an eye towards equity and equitable outcomes. And we look at this, in the scorecard through sort of, three. We use three main sort of metrics to look at this. And the first of which is we look at equity-driven community engagement. And particularly, what's important to note here is that, that we're looking to see that cities are demonstrating a really unique and expanded approach when they're doing engagement around a policy or plan that reaches out to marginalized groups in ways that brings them and their voices into the process. But we're also looking to make sure that there's a direct dialogue going on between folks in those communities and the folks that are responsible for making decisions at the local level, so that input and that feedback isn't getting lost somewhere. We also look at sort of equity-driven decision-making, and that's really focused around whether the city has maybe created a formal role for marginalized communities, organizations representing them, to participate in decision-making, so actually driving and making decisions about, where money is spent, what programs are going forward, what's the priority in a plan, those sorts of things. And finally, we're looking to see whether cities are actually kind of holding their feet to the fire, right? So this final sort of metric that we have looks at the degree to which there are goals, metrics, other protocols to keep people committed to the equitable process that they're trying to pursue. So I'll just wrap up here by saying that, when you look across the scorecard, I said there are 100 cities. 35 of those 100 pursue at least one of these activities. And you can see the breakdown here between engagement, decision-making, and accountability. I will also point out that 14 cities pursued new activities between our 2019 scorecard and the 2020 scorecard. So you are seeing cities that are starting to pick up on some of this work, but there's a lot of work to go. We're really looking only at about roughly a third of the cities in the scorecard that are doing something on this. And really only 4 cities, as you can see, Minneapolis, Providence, Portland, and Seattle. And we're going to hear from a couple folks that are working in a couple of these places are pursuing all 3 of those activities that I highlighted to some degree. So with that, I'll just sign off by saying, if you'd like to learn more about some of this, like I said, just quick intro from me, but there's some links you'll find in the slides that we share for the scorecard. We have a resource that looks at our equity analysis more specifically and some of those other dimensions I mentioned. And our state and local policy database contains a lot of information on policies and programs that we're tracking. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Stefan, for sharing that overview. And now we're going to hear from a few of our city partners. So the next speaker is Monica Huertas, who's the Green Justice Zone Coordinator on the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee of Providence. And she'll be speaking about some of the work that the committee has done with the city. And thank you, Monica, for being here. And I will pass it over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I just want to go back a little bit, some of the history behind, what I do and how we came to develop the Climate Justice Plan. And so one of the things I've been working for about 5 years now to stop the construction of a liquefied natural gas facility here in the city of Providence. And that's how I kind of got started with doing environmental work. But really, before that, I was working in the city a lot with housing and jobs and creating opportunities for people who had just came out of jail. And I had grown up in the city being homeless and just food unstable, housing unstable. Then I finally kind of did everything the way that it's taught for us to do, go to school and keep learning and graduate and get a nice job. And so anyways, after I did all that, I got a nice little house and I thought, wow, like the quote unquote American dream, right? It had finally happened for me after so many years. And then I'm like, oh, yep, I'm going to have a cute little garden and I'll have this and that. And then the realtor is like, no, you can't do that. And I'm like, why? It's my house. They're like, no, we have tons of lead And then also you have to get this water filtration system and make sure you don't have no lead. And he gave me a kit to swipe on the walls. And I'm like, what kind of craziness? Like, I had no idea that we had such bad infrastructures in Providence. And so as I started doing research, I found out, like, damn, I thought I had, like, accomplished everything that I wanted to, and then now everything was going to be good. And then it's like, wait, no, the dirt that you just bought is contaminated. The house you bought, it actually has high levels of lead. And one of my children got lead poisoning shortly after we moved in to this house. And I'm like, and then I'm like, can I grow tomatoes? And they're like, no, you can't grow that. I'm like, what the heck? So I started doing research, and I finally found out that, you know, it really contaminated. We, you know, low-income housing and even affordable, you know, houses that, you know, are meant for, like, Black and brown folks to buy are really just bad housing, and just houses that other people don't want. And so they just give it to us, you know, with a low mortgage and things like that. And so fast forward a little bit later, 3 of my 4 children got diagnosed with really bad asthma. One of them, the first year that we moved here, actually the first to the second year that we moved here, they were hospitalized 7 times due to their asthma exacerbations. And so again, I started looking, and that just propelled me to, like, looking at this, at where we live. And really, a lot of people weren't organizing around the issues of environment here, specifically where I live, which is in the Port of Providence. So we have, like, this really nice water view and a nice working port, but it's really bottom of the barrel stuff. We don't have any good quality, like, commerce. Everything is scrap metal or jet fuel oil for the local airport. They added LNG. So anyways, it's this really bad toxic. It's like tar and cement, really bad toxic, no good things there in the port. And so again, we started organizing, and then we came up with working with the city, and a couple of us, we formed the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee, which really works collaboratively with the city of Providence, and really puts at the forefront racial inequities and racial justice before even environment. So when we first started, we didn't even talk about environment, like typical environmental things that you would think a city and community members talk about. We talked about housing, and we talked about jobs, and then eventually we talked about, you know, heating and cooling, and how we got our heat and how we got our cooling, and how we don't have trees, and how we need jobs, and the school to prison pipeline, and really made the connections of all of that with the environment. And then, you know, little by little, we had the city adopt a document that said, you know, Providence was built on indigenous land, stolen indigenous land. It was, you know, built off of the backs of enslaved folks and off the back of migrant workers. And so, you know, and this was adopted by the Office of Sustainability. And again, folks are saying, what does that have to do with the environment? But of course, we all know that, you know, it's correlated, and it has a lot of, it really says a lot about where we're living, the time we're living in now, and how we're living as a society when, you know, Black and brown folks are the ones who pollute the less, have the lowest carbon, you know, footprint, yet we are seeing the most heavily impact of climate change. We're seeing it. We're being impacted the most, whether it's in Puerto Rico, you know, with Maria, or whether it's over here in the city of Providence in Olneyville, where there was, you know, the 100-year flood happened 10 years ago, and it's predicted to happen again soon, you know. So anyways, I don't know if folks have any questions about that, but I think I'm going to pass it to Leah now, and then Leah's going to give a little bit of more information about how we came up with the climate justice plan, and what are we doing now to kind of see it happen. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monica, for joining us and sharing your story of how you've, you know, gotten into the space and the work that you've been doing. Now we're going to hear from Leah Bamberger, who is the Director of Sustainability with the City of Providence. Leah will discuss the city's efforts to center equity in its clean energy planning and programs, and I'll pass it over to Leah.
Great, thank you, and thanks again, Monica, for sharing that, your work, your background, your history. It's really important context for the work we've been doing here in Providence. I am just going to move the slides along here. So yes, my name is Leah Bamberger. I'm the Director of Sustainability for the City of Providence. I've been in my role for about 5.5 years. And just kind of going back to, sorry, I'm struggling with these slides here, the history of Providence, and Monica started talking about the connection between our history and slavery. Most people think about this as, one, not really connected to climate change, and also a Southern thing. And it's really important to understand that the Industrial Revolution, which really began here in Providence in the Blackstone River Valley, was fueled by cotton that was grown with slave labor in the South. And it generated an immense amount of wealth for the city of Providence and for white colonizers. It also had a tremendous impact on our landscape, our culture, dramatically impact everything that we do, how we orient our days. It transformed our landscape, pollution, with the rivers and the mills that were built along them. And people started moving to the cities. There was a urbanization that was happening. There's a connection between our school systems and public school systems and the Industrial Revolution. Because so many people were going into the workplace, into the factories, there needed a place for children to be during the day. And so, yeah, this had a big impact, and it's important to understand that this legacy is a lot of what we're still dealing with today. Monica talked about contamination in our soils, the impact of these factories that, this is of course a current picture of Providence, and some of these mills are finding opportunities for reuse, but there's still a significant legacy of that environmental impact that we're dealing with today from the Industrial Revolution. And of course, there's a connection to climate change. So I think what's important to connect here is that fuel, the labor from the slave labor from the South that was bringing up the cotton, and the pollution that was the result of that, those are very much connected. That extraction of labor and the extraction of resources are connected. And we need to remember that as we're tackling the solutions here to the problem and making sure we're considering the whole breadth of the problem. So when Mayor Lorza here in Providence set a goal to become carbon neutral by 2050, we set out to create a plan to get there. And as Monica was talking about, we did a lot of work just on talking about understanding racial equity. We did anti-racism trainings. We adopted the Just Providence framework, which was created by the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. And we also did once we did a lot of that kind of base work and foundational work and understanding systemic racism and the connection to climate change and the work at hand, we also did some analysis on our greenhouse gas emissions and where those emissions would be if we essentially did nothing by 2050. And of course, not too much would change. So we then set out to really develop our process. And again, kind of looking back on some of these environmental justice issues in Providence, we wanted to make sure we were centering frontline communities, and frontline communities are those folks who are most impacted by the climate crisis. And we got very specific in Providence of where and who those communities were. And again, this was definitions and identification that was done by the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee, which is a group of 10 residents in Providence who are all frontline community members. And they were, through some grant funds and other resources, we created the committee and we were able to compensate them for their time, which was really important to our process. We also looked at asthma as another example of a way that these communities are burdened by environmental issues in Providence. And even the map on the right shows emergency department visits for children with asthma in Medicaid. And so you can see on the port area, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but that area that's what Monica was speaking about, the port. Highway 95 goes through there, and it's a hotspot for asthma. We are also dealing with lead contamination, right? And most of this is coming from soils, again, connecting it back to the legacy of the Industrial Revolution in the past. We have some, this data is a few years old. It's from 2014, and we've made some progress, but these numbers are way too high for any place, but especially in the United States, this should not be accepted. And again, it's the same communities that are burdened by asthma, by high unemployment, by housing issues that are grappling with these challenges. And then looking ahead to the future impacts of sea level rise, this, again, you can see the port area would be inundated by the end of the century. Thinking about all of those industries that Monica was talking about in that area, if those were to be flooded or inundated during a storm, that would be a huge, huge problem. A public health crisis, it would be a catastrophe for these communities and really the state at large. And right there is the Rhode Island Hospital. It's the region's only level 1 trauma center. So it's a substantial vulnerability. So our approach, we took a targeted universalism approach. And what that means is, again, we were really making sure we were centering those who are most impacted and starting on the margins and working our way in. Oftentimes in policy, we try to design solutions that are going to capture the most people. Think about it as capturing the middle class, right? Those are, if you think about solar, let's design programs so the most people can go solar. But what happens is we never get to the margins in that case. So solar is not accessible to low-income residents. It's not accessible to folks who don't own their home. If we start and we design programs that reach those folks, we will ensure that we'll get everyone. And so I use the vegetable peeler story to illustrate this because the gentleman who designed the black OXO vegetable peeler that you see here, his mother had arthritis and she was using this metal one and really struggled, really couldn't use it. So he set out to design a vegetable peeler that she could use and ultimately ended up with this one, the black one. And it's a vegetable peeler that is better for everyone to use, right? So it's a great example of how when we design for folks at the margins who are, have whatever disadvantage or disenfranchisement that's happened, we design solutions for them, and that way we ensure that it will work for everyone. So moving into our climate planning process, we wanted to make sure we had an equitable process so we got to those equitable outcomes. I noticed there was a question earlier about process versus outcomes, and I really applaud ACEEE for starting with the process because I think that's a really important place to be, and outcomes, I think we'll get there, but I personally believe that the process is really one of the most important pieces of this work. So we continue to work with the REJC and designed our community-centered process. The REJC led some education and training in their communities. Then the folks who were trained went out and did peer-led interviews of their frontline community members, of their neighbors, their family, et cetera. And they asked very simple questions. They asked, how do you stay warm in the winter? What's good about that? What would you change? How do you stay cool in the summer? What's good about that? What would you change? How do you get around the city? What's good about that? What would you change? And is there anything in your community that's making you sick? And based on what we heard, we designed solutions around those priorities and concerns of frontline communities. At no point did we have a big public meeting that, asked folks to come out, tell us what you think, what should be in our climate plan, because we knew if we did that, we would get all the usual suspects and it would essentially drown out the frontline community members that we were really trying to prioritize in our process. And so we went, we took those solutions, We had a very laborious process to make sure that they were equitable, that they were meeting all of the concerns that we heard from frontline communities. And in order to reflect them back to the folks that participated, we had a lot of technical policies and a long list of action items. And the REJC came up with the idea of creating these future stories of Providence that touch upon all of the solutions that are in the Climate Action Plan, or what we now call it's our Climate Justice Plan. So these stories, they're on our website. I encourage you to check them out. But it's a really creative way of showing what Providence could look like for these communities if we implement the Climate Justice Plan. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but here are some examples of what we heard, just basic issues around heating infrastructure in homes, not having heat, not having windows that open or close, concerns about gentrification and displacement, wanting to, community members wanting to make sure that if they are making investments to change and improve their communities, they want to make sure that they don't get kicked out. And then, of course, concerns around the port and pollution. One of our sort of guiding frameworks that came out of this process, actually, we started diving into this before, but we have a whole section in the plan around collaborative governance. And again, this is where emphasizing the process, right? We want to make sure that as we do this work, we're working towards moving across this spectrum to a collaborate or even defer to stage. When we started this work, about a couple of years in, we had an evaluation, and we found that we were right around the 2 or the 3, the consult and the involve stage. And that was after years of really investing in this work. So we still have a lot work to do, and we're not quite there yet. But I think it's important to emphasize that this is a process, and you can't just jump. If you don't have a relationship with frontline communities as either a government or perhaps a traditional white-led nonprofit that's trying to do this work in partnership, you can't just jump to that collaborative stage. If you've been historically ignoring or placating these communities, there has to be capacity building and shifts that happen on both sides in order to get to a place where you can truly collaborate and share power and get towards the end of the spectrum. So as I mentioned, I check out these feature stories on our website. They're really beautiful pieces of work. They're audio clips, so you can listen to them at any time in English or Spanish. And that is it for me. And I think we'll do questions at the end. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. And now we will turn it over to our final speaker, who is Oriana Magnera, an energy policy coordinator at Verde in Portland, Oregon. Oriana will be discussing the Zero Cities project in Portland, and I will now turn it over to her.
Thanks, Ariel. My name is Oriana Magnera. I am the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Manager at Verde, which is a community-based organization in the Cully neighborhood in Portland. And for those not familiar with Portland, the Cully neighborhood is the neighborhood nearest the airport. And I always start with that when I describe Cully, because I think it starts to be emblematic of how I start to stack up the other environmental justice concerns that come up. We first have pollution from the airport. Then the neighborhood has air pollution from the railroad. And then there's a diesel trucking corridor that runs along Columbia Boulevard, which is actually where my office was located back when we went to offices more often. And then we also have a fair amount of industry in the Cully neighborhood. We have an asphalt grinding facility. We have a glass recycling facility. And there's an incredible amount of toxic air pollution that comes out of both of those facilities on top of many other industrial processes in the neighborhood. But those are the two largest sources of air pollution in the neighborhood in Cully, on top of that diesel trucking corridor and the railroad and the airport. So Cully is what is known as an environmental justice community. It's a community where it's mostly Black and brown folks. It's mostly folks with lower incomes, and it's mostly folks who, because of the history of redlining and other planning and housing processes and the way our cities have developed that both speakers from Providence alluded to, that the homes that were available and continue to be available for Black, Brown, and folks with lower incomes, community members to purchase or rent or live in are often in these neighborhoods that have really hazardous conditions, or from a planning perspective, those facilities were sited in neighborhoods because they were far from where white, wealthy folks live. And when you look at a map of Portland and kind of where air pollution sources are, that starts to play out pretty clearly in terms of our history of redlining as a city. So that's the harmful context in Cully, but Cully is also an incredibly diverse and vibrant neighborhood full of community members who are incredibly passionate about the work that they do. Verde has a Líderes Verdes program where we're building environmental justice leadership for community members. And the organization came about 15 years ago when we, or our founder, realized that as green infrastructure was starting to go into the city, in particular rain gardens for stormwater management, because as folks may know, Portland is a pretty rainy city, especially this time of year, although as you can see to my right, it's actually a pretty nice sunny day, so we're grateful for that. But that rain garden infrastructure was first going in wealthy white neighborhoods that already had all of these advantages, and not going into neighborhoods for Black or Brown folks with lower incomes. But then when that infrastructure would come in, it would lead to gentrification and displacement because home values would go up, the neighborhood would be seen as more desirable. And so Verde was developed as a social enterprise to do that rain garden installation work, but to employ community members. And from that built a much bigger vision of building environmental wealth through communities, through social enterprise, through organizing, and through advocacy. And that has started to manifest in an energy plan for the Cully neighborhood in Portland. We have a number of conservation and generation projects that we developed co-creatively with community members to help people to stay in their homes through lower energy bills, through healthier and safer homes, to build wealth through community members, to create jobs and new opportunity, to help people to participate in this clean energy future that many of us are envisioning, but ensure that it's actually accessible to community members in a meaningful way. So how does that tie into Zero Cities, or as I'll later start to call it, the Build Shift project? Leah from Providence mentioned kind of the spectrum of engagement, and I wanted to share it here. I think folks are, for the most part, familiar. It comes from Movement Strategy Center out in Oakland, California, who helped to consult on this project that we were working on. But I think it's helpful to remember how community members have involved in decision-making. If community members were involved in decision-making in Cully, we probably wouldn't have the asphalt grinding facility. We probably wouldn't have the bottle recycling facility. We wouldn't have all these other harms in the community. We might have a community that looks a lot more like the park that community helped to build co-creatively on a brownfield site. If we were deferring to communities in our work, we might see visions that look very different. So Verde really wanted to look at where community engagement typically happens at a city level. When we were approached by the city of Portland to partner on this Zero City project, which was initially presented to us as a roadmap to net zero buildings. And we looked at that and said, we have a climate action plan. This looks like a little bit like a plan within a plan. How do we turn this into a meaningful opportunity, not just to involve community in a process or build a roadmap and have community consult on whether they like it or not and tell us what they don't like, maybe even go beyond collaboration and to defer into community to really envision what does a future where we have buildings that generate their own energy and that are efficient and safe and healthy for communities. What does that look like in a way that is driven by community vision and doesn't start with a there, but really starts with the question of where do we want to go? So we developed a set of project goals for the Zero Cities project. And we wanted to develop relationships across communities through an interactive participatory curriculum around buildings and energy. We wanted to build collective understanding of how energy impacts planning and building design. We wanted to define building through a lens of how community interacts with structures or how buildings are experienced, and acknowledge that oftentimes when we talk about buildings and electrification and different processes, we're not always talking about the way buildings interact with the world through gardens or transportation or other means. We really talk about the structure literally as a box. So we wanted to think outside the box in a meaningful way. We also wanted to redefine or define net zero, because that's not a term that necessarily means a lot to community members. and really think about like what are the actual goals that we want to reach. And my next slide will get into a little bit more about what the redefinition means, and then just help community to understand who are the institutions and entities and decision makers that influence how community interacts with buildings. This Zero Cities project was funded and developed through the U.S. Sustainability Directors Network, and partners on the project included Movement Strategy Center, Race Forward, Architecture 2030, New Buildings Institute, and Resource Media, who are all partners who supported the work. But the big contribution from Race Forward was developing this equity assessment tool that kind of frames a new way of thinking, not just about like, are we getting carbon out of our buildings through energy usage or embedded carbon, but how are we balancing that reduction in emissions? And from an environmental justice perspective, Verde likes to talk about emissions more broadly than just carbon, because there are many harmful things like NOx and methane and byproducts, especially from the asphalt grinding facility and the bottling recycling facility in the neighborhood that do a lot more harm than carbon. So we sometimes find carbon to be a focus that draws away from other harmful emissions. So how do we balance emissions versus racial equity? And Race Forward put together a really helpful guide that included some strong metrics of what are the intersecting issues around racial justice that interact with emissions and interact with buildings. And so we looked at that, and our Bureau of Planning and Sustainability as a partner in the project was really focused on helping us to gain the knowledge and information that we needed. Rather than driving the project, they deferred to community, they deferred to Verde and partner organizations, Imagine Black, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, the Coalition of Communities of Color, Opal Environmental Justice, Leaders Become Legends, and Unite Oregon, who are all other community-based organizations representing different communities around the city, deferred to a participatory action research process. And participatory action research is a way that says that community is often studied. They're often the information that is about community. The community is not often trusted to be a source of information and to help co-creatively determine what are the questions we want to ask and where do we want to go. Again, we often start with it there and not necessarily a where. And so the city helped to develop a number of maps. This is a map of displacement risk analysis for the city of Portland. And it looked very different than it did about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, that kind of really dark purple where the risk is greatest would have been closer into the river and kind of the north part of the city, which is a traditionally Black neighborhood. But because of displacement and gentrification, often caused by investments in neighborhoods like the ones I was talking about earlier, like rain gardens, have pushed people to East Portland. And now the risk is greatest there. And people are getting displaced again into the city of Gresham, which is the city east of Portland, and into other parts of the Portland metro area. We also looked at energy burden in the city. And there are a couple of outliers here that I won't get into, but if someone wants to ask me a question about what that big red tract is, which is actually where a big park is in the city and why that's so energy burden, there's actually a good reason for that. But you start to see some similar impacts, that the energy burden is a little bit more intense on the east side of Portland, where folks with lower incomes who are Black, Brown, or Indigenous live, and then some neighborhoods that were traditionally more BIPOC and lower income, that have more energy burden for those folks but are slowly gentrifying. You start to see that play out here. And we knew that the interaction between buildings and energy for many community members had a lot to do with how they were paying for their energy and how that was impacting their lives. Could they actually keep the lights on? Could they keep going? So I mentioned participatory action research before as our methodology to look at these maps, to remap them, to figure out what are the questions we want to ask. How do we make this an engaging process where we share some really wonky technical information with community, but also get a sense of what their lived experience is within that and value that. So participatory action research allows community to ask the question of where do we want to go, to define the problems that they face, and then also to chart the path, to build that roadmap to where do we want to go, what are the solutions that we want to see, what are the strategies that we want to use, and then put those into place. So our goal with this process was always to result in some policy making that is led and developed by community around buildings and energy, rather than having our Bureau of Planning and Sustainability start with a proposal and bring it to community and maybe get a little bit of feedback and sign off, and then take it to our city council and the whole thing is kind of baked. We often use the analogy of baking the cake together, putting the ingredients together when we talk about organizing between civic institutions and community or community-based organizations. But I often ask the question of, what if we don't even want to make a cake? What if we want to use a whole different set of ingredients and make some other kind of dish or opportunity? And that's what we were trying to do with this project is use the kitchen of the city, but bring in our own ingredients and decide to make something that maybe we've never even tried or tasted before. So about a year ago, on December 14th of 2019, we had our community members who first participated in a training on buildings and energy, and then went through a participatory action research process to develop this community forum. We had about 20 community members in the first training, and then 12 who participated in a bilingual participatory action research process to build this forum. And we had 50 community members, many of whom were not staff of community-based organizations, but actually connected to communities in a meaningful way. And this was kind of a first that we saw in climate or energy organizing in the city, where often the work has been done by staff of community-based organizations and some key leaders. This was a space entirely of community members who were really excited to learn about buildings and energy and share their experiences. And we hosted the forum at this building. It's a former brownfield, a former gas station in the formerly Black part of the city in North Portland. And it is a home for the Deltas, which is a Black sorority alumni chapter. And they redeveloped this building to be a net zero building on this brownfield site. And so we really wanted to host the forum in a place where people could see, what does the net zero building look like? And what does it look like in a community context? And here's a picture from the forum of, it was a completely Black and brown space, which was really significant for this work too. And we had BIPOC staff from the city working on the project as well, and supporting the organizing. And we had a number of different stations as part of the process, where we asked folks to pretend that they were at a city council hearing to talk about the split incentive and how do we make sure that renters benefit from these changes. We had a focus group on housing and displacement issues. We had a visioning activity where people wrote collective poems about the kinds of community energy projects that they wanted to see in their neighborhood and help us define, what does community energy mean? And we did a number of other activities, and I'll talk a little bit more about the data we gathered and what we learned from community and what the next steps are. But the most important thing we learned was this picture is in the background. There are some sticky notes on what was a tree that we drew that looked at values that the community wanted to see the city hold in the work that it's do, something it loved about their community, a challenge it had, and then the values they held within their own community as the roots. And then that trunk was what they held and saw as opportunities and challenges in their community, and the leaves, the fruit that they wanted to create, was what change they wanted to see in the city. And it came down to three primary changes that community wanted to see in terms of how the city does not just climate policy, but other policy as well. The first was repairing the broken trust. And we heard a little bit from the Providence folks about that broken trust that needs to be repaired between city and community, and processes that are not meaningful or actively harmful to community members. Creating more opportunities to listen, to truly be co-creative in the work, and then putting that into practice over and over again. And so just some of the lessons we learned in doing this process around how to do this engagement more meaningfully was connecting with new people, those new people who came to the forum who'd never been engaged in climate work or energy work and kind of the active spaces that already existed. That building trust was important, especially when mistakes were made, really showing strong reparative efforts about how to reframe agendas or do the work in new ways. Sharing and valuing lived experience, which is something that community understood strongly, but I think the city really saw that come into practice in a meaningful way. Holding bilingual spaces and not just doing all of the work in English. That's something my organization Verde, which organizes a lot of Latinx community members, feels very strongly about, but really brought it to a city process for the first time. The importance of Black and brown spaces and Black and brown only spaces, bringing in technical expertise, and really figuring out how to merge that with lived experience. And that trusted invitations from community members is often the best way to do organizing. Again, this is something that Verde really understood, but I think the city really learned and saw put into practice how powerful trusted messengers can be. And we learned from different pieces. We'll be doing a future energy cost burden survey as our second part of our work. But we learned that people really value non-traditional ways of living, that when we talk about affordable housing and anti-displacement, community members really want to see new structures come into place, that they want to see community solar, green spaces, community gardens. And we also realized in doing this kind of policy solutions lab, this mock city council hearing where folks talked about the split incentive, that issue that landlords are not incentivized to make energy improvements. But they wanted minimum standards for housing to make housing healthy, safe, and keep energy bills low that all landlords have to abide by. They wanted to make sure that there was stable rent as improvements were made, that there were incentives to invest in clean energy on all kinds of land and buildings, and that they wanted a renter right to know for people to know how much their energy cost was going to be. And so we decided to take that into a second phase where community is leading a process, a second participatory action research process to develop an ordinance to address this issue of building performance standards for rentals. This comes directly from feedback that was received by community, and community is going to write the ordinance. And so this is a picture of our team who did the participatory action research work. But as we've kind of gone through this process, we've also realized we don't want to be defined by a single grant project, Zero Cities. We've actually renamed and reformed as Build Shift, which is a partnership between the city of Portland and all of these organizations and community members who are stipended to do this work, who are building community across Portland, sharing knowledge and community wisdom, and shifting political power to Black and Brown folks through leadership development and participatory policymaking. This fall, and I'll rush through this last little bit quick because I know we're running short on time, we hosted a series of online convenings to address kind of this current COVID and racial uprising moment, and to see what was going on for community members. And so we took what we learned about how to host a meaningful convening and put it into practice for the issues that were most important to community. And then our next process is we're going to do this ordinance development. So we're building a new team at the current moment. We actually have an orientation for new team members later today. We're planning a convening that will start with an energy cost burden survey and help people understand a little bit more about how to read their energy bills and what energy cost burden means and how to save energy and all of that. And then we'll, from that, gather some data to help start doing policy development and really start to understand what does community want from an ordinance that sets standards for rentals. And then we'll do some data analysis to help kind of really shape the technical language of that policy. And then we'll continue a process of ordinance development and hopefully send an ordinance to council in November. And then below is just a sense of what are the resources that we're providing to organizations who are participating and giving staff time to the project, and to community members who are participating and doing the bulk of the work. And this is just another image of our team who came and presented the project to council in February, and will continue to lead in the work. And there's my contact information if you want it. But thanks for your time and your consideration, and really excited and honored to be here, especially with the great work that's happening in Providence.
Great. Thank you so much, Oriana, for that great presentation. I really enjoyed hearing about all of the work that you've been doing recently. So we now have time to address a few questions from the audience. We've had some great ones come in so far. If you have a question you want to ask, you can submit it through the Q&A tool as well. All right, so to start off, so I have a question for, I think, all of the speakers. Have any of the speakers conducted successful community engagement during COVID? And if so, what was the biggest factor in successfully engaging the community while also maintaining social distancing?
So I was actually just typing in an answer to that, and this is Oriana from Verde. The 3 convenings I mentioned, and I'll go back to this slide, were all online. And it took us a number of months and much slower work than we anticipated to actually pull them together, just given that COVID makes it very hard to organize, that many of our community members, especially the Black folks on our team, were really impacted by just kind of the increased attention on racial justice and the police violence that is always happening in our communities. and in particular Black communities, but was really amplified this summer. And then we also had a death on our team of one of the city staff members passed away in July, and that kind of slowed us down. We still had these online convenings. The first one had about 20 people, the second 15, and the last one was 40. And I think our big lesson on that was like, this was right before the election and people really wanted to talk about community safety in election. So doing a little bit of pre-work is really meaningful to kind of figure out what are people excited about and how do we get them to a space. Like people will come where there's interest just the way they would to an in-person event. But I think one of the biggest barriers is technology access. And so also finding what are the technology needs for community and taking resources that you might put towards like food or childcare that you may not need and helping to pay for somebody's internet or provide like a Chromebook or provide the technology to participate. So there are definitely new challenges in how to make things engaging. You're welcome to reach out to Ariel and get my contact information. I'd be happy to set a separate time to talk through like how to put together an engaging Google slide deck. And my organization is also doing an Energy Justice Leadership Institute for 150 community members from around the state of Oregon right now, all online. So I think we're trying to figure out how do you create engaging online spaces. And there are a lot of good tips and tricks for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Oriana. Anything that Leah and Monica want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we did a lot of similar things, you know, like the Zooms, and we had quite a bit of successful meetings in the Zoom. But we also we still did some door knocking, and we also did some surveying. We posted up at the libraries with like a survey and gave folks $5. And then also we did still keep in our budget the child care and the food stipends, only because it's like people still need to eat and have child care even though they're home. I have 4 children, and I was like, I need you guys to pay somebody if you guys think that I have to sit on a Zoom call for 2 hours, you know? And so even if a person is, you know, with a mask on, I do need that extra help. And a lot of our community members need that extra help. And then also just assuming just because you're home with like your husband doesn't mean that, or your partner doesn't mean that, you know, you automatically have childcare, right? Because they might be doing something else too. And so we did that. And then also we even gave folks stipends for some meals, because again, people got to eat, and then maybe everybody can have, you know, $20 to go buy something at the store, and then at a specific time in our meeting, we can all eat together, you know, so nobody's left out. Yeah, I just wanted to add those things.
Thank you. All right. So another question came in for all of the speakers again, asking what metrics should local governments track to ensure that they're being held accountable to equity-related goals? And also, how do you engage community groups to ensure that they are helping to define these metrics?
I can start. I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but it's something that we're working. You know, the Climate Justice Plan outlines a lot of metrics, and right now we're going through and trying to figure out what can we actually measure now and what makes sense. What data do we have? There's a lot of data that we just don't have, so that's part of the problem. One of the things that the REJC and their community members were really pushing for us in the Climate Justice Plan was to kind of downscale our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So we have, you know, citywide rough data to understand our citywide carbon footprint, but we don't have more like geospatial data about where are those direct emissions actually coming from. We do know if we were able to do that, we would see that most of them are coming from the port or from, you know, along Highway 95. And what we strive to do is prioritize reducing those emissions in our overall emission reduction goals, because those, if we're reducing those emissions, while they might be more challenging to measure and to actually reduce, you know, how do you reduce like the 95 that just happens to go through Providence, right? We don't have a lot of control over that. But if we reduce those emissions, we're also improving the livelihoods of our frontline community members, improving public health, and so many other important co-benefits. So that really needs to be a priority. But tracking it, of course, these are long-term goals, and we don't always have the data. So we're looking at air quality monitors and other kind of downscaled ways to measure that.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. So a few people have asked how long the process took for both the processes happening in Providence and in Portland that were described. How long did it take to develop these engagement processes from the beginning to end? And then I'll just tack on another question that was asked. If either of you have had any involvement from Native American communities in your coalitions, and if so, how you were able to build those relationships?
So in Portland, we have a fairly large Indigenous population compared to, I think, a lot of other states and communities. So the Native American Youth and Family Center, NAYA, is a really active organization. They weren't able to participate significantly in the first phase of our project, but will be receiving support to participate in the second phase. And we had Indigenous community members who participated on the first Participatory Action Research Team and through the forum, but we've actually been really active in recruitment for the second phase to really prioritize that and make sure that we have a little bit more balance across the team, because we think that's very important. I think in organizing with Indigenous communities, it's important to remember, one, that when we talk about like planning or climate or energy work, to just remember the context of like colonialism and the fact that we're on stolen land. You know, it's not enough to do a land acknowledgement, but also really move resources is a key piece. And then also just acknowledging cultural differences, as you do with any community, but in particular, going slower, that trust is sometimes harder to build, and really kind of being mindful of how the work is done, and in particular, the approach to time can, like, really slowing things down and kind of sitting in the moment can be really helpful in building trust with Indigenous communities, in my experience.
Great, thank you. Anything Leah and Monica would like to add?
I would just add one about the Indigenous piece. When we created the REJC, we had seats for different I guess in some cases communities, but, you know, we had a racial justice seat, an environmental justice seat, a youth seat, and then a couple of specific neighborhoods that were frontline communities. And we also had an Indigenous seat, and that was the one seat that we didn't really prioritize, making sure the participant was a Providence resident, understanding that these people have been displaced, and also letting the Indigenous community organize and be represented in a way that made sense for their ways of being. So it was, again, I think building off of the points just made, being flexible and acknowledging the way that these other communities, Indigenous communities, organize was really important.
All right, now I have a question for Stefan. So someone asks, it seems like ACEEE's equity-related scorecard metrics are mostly process-focused. Are there any metrics that are more outcome-focused? And are there any new metrics that ACEEE is thinking about for future scorecard additions that would advance equity?
Okay, so you're right. There's not a lot of metrics that are focused on outcomes, and as the other speakers have mentioned, one of the reasons for that is a lot of cities are not, at the point yet of really doing a lot of tracking of sort of the data that you think about with outcomes, and even those that are, one of the things we look for across the sort of standardization data, so we can look at and compare cities, and looking at outcome data for equity work is currently kind of difficult to do with what's out there. So that's an element. We do look at, I will just point out thing, we do look at sort of the the proximity for low-income households to high-quality, consistent, reliable transit in the past quarter. And I'll say for the future editions, we're looking to hopefully look at more outcome data. We're asking a whole slew of questions in the upcoming survey we send out to cities, asking for more specifics and hopefully not only just documenting those outcomes and sharing them, but also, our hope is to kind of make our metrics more rigorous so that we're, really recognizing cities demonstrating that they've, done some good work.
Great, thank you, Stefan. And with that, we are at time. I will say there are a lot of really great questions that came in, and feel free to reach out to the speakers today with your questions if they weren't answered on the webinar. And I thank everyone for participating in today's webcast, and we will be sending a link to the recording as well in about a day or so. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend ahead, and we look forward to seeing you on another one of these soon. Have a great day.